So we're here in the Ballygawley Woods today, and we're right along the Sligo Way, and I'm delighted to be joined by Pat today, and he's here at this very ancient site. This is what archaeologists call a stone row, and it's thought that stone rows date to the Bronze Age, so we're talking about 4,000 years old, and really they consist of two stones or more, and this one has 3 stones in a line, which is why we call it a row. And we don't really understand why these were put here, for what reason. Perhaps it defined some kind of a boundary between different tribes, that this was their land and this was the other tribe's land here. It may be that this marks the burial place of a warrior, someone important in the community. So we're not entirely sure, but they're very interesting stones. And these stones, Pat, you were telling me, have a great story associated with them, that not many stone rows have a tale like this with them.
Yes, that's right. People like to have a story about something that they didn't fully understand or didn't know all about, and they like to think, how did this happen? And the story is that there was this McHugh, this famous woman. She was wise, very, very wise. She was wealthy, she was prosperous, and she lived across the side of the mountain back over there. In fact, some people say that she had a house on the front of the mountain. You could see it if the trees weren't in front of us. And she had this cow, and the cow was the source of all of her wisdom and of all of her wealth, and she looked after it. It was well bedded, it was well fed, and it was well housed, and she really did look after it. But one night, a man and his son, they decided, we want this cow for ourselves. We want all of this for ourselves, the wealth and the wisdom. And they came to her house and stole in, took the cow and brought it across the side of the mountain and brought it down along this way, heading home over towards towards the lake over behind us. And when they got here, she caught up with them. And she had brought her magic wand with her. And she threatened them and she told them, I want my cow back, and they wouldn't give it back to her. They resisted every effort she made, every argument she made, and she said, look, if you don't, she said, I'm going to use my magic wand on you and you'll be sorry. And the man still wouldn't. So she turned to the boy and she hit him with the wand, and he was turned into stone. And the man still resisted and wouldn't give in. And she struck him. But she struck him so hard that she also struck the cow that was on the far side of him and turned the cow into stone as well.
So she turned her own prize cow to stone.
Exactly.
And we can see it here. This is the representation of the cow, and you can see it as if it's lying down with the head up.
Yes, she's still lying there. The cow is waiting to be turned back into, a living creature. But never.
And the Cailleach, what was the Cailleach? Was she a form of witch, or? It
was the old Irish name for an old woman, and it was used to describe all sorts of different women. We'll say some will say powerful women. She was a powerful woman. She was almost a goddess, right? And a lot of people know there used to be a poem called Misha Éire, Shiname, and Cailleach Beara. Ireland is older than the Cailleach Beara. She was old, and she had great powers. She lived for many, many years. In fact, for so long, she just got tired of living and she couldn't die. And she decided, I have to end this someday. And she went over from the house on the mountain up here. She went over the top of the mountain down to a lake called Loch Dogay, the lake of the 2 geese. It's supposed to be a bottomless lake. And she threw herself into the lake and she drowned in that lake.
And so the moral of the story, don't mess with the Cailleach. She's very powerful.
Yes.
She's possibly an old deity or an old goddess.
Yes.
And it's great to see that association here with these stories, with this monument here.
You won't get the better of the goddess.
Kate, and we're in South Sligo, just a little bit outside Ballymote. And we're here on the side of a cliff, and this is Keshcorn Mountain. And there's a whole series of caves here. And I'm joined by Sam Moore, who's an archaeologist, and Sam's going to tell me about, you know, what's so interesting and important about these caves, Sam.
Well, thanks very much, Tamlyn. These are an amazing collection of caves. There's 17 of them. And I think the most striking thing about them is that you can see them for a long distance. You know, there's quite big cave mouths, and you can see them for miles. If anybody ever drives from the airport at Knock past Tubbercurry and you look this direction, you can actually see the caves even from that distance. So they're very striking. The caves themselves were formed, over millions of years from water flowing through the limestone. Water dissolves the acid in the water, dissolves the limestone over a very slow period. So these have been truncated. They've been cut by an ice sheet moving by the side of the mountain. So you get these big cave mouths. So the caves take different forms. So these are really spectacular. So they were formed, the mountain itself was formed about 300 million years ago, a little bit more, when all of this was actually underneath a warm, shallow tropical sea. And so limestone is dead marine life. But over millions of years then, water trickling through the rock makes these caves. You would have had streams flowing out that become relic over time. And then a big glacier during the Ice Age, more than 10,000 years ago, carved this cliff face off the side of the mountain, exposing these big cave mouth entrances.
And we can still see that there's water permeating through.
Yeah, you can still see, it's still...
And did people ever live in these caves, or were they, what kind of way did humans?
Okay, so all around the world people see caves often as not as otherworldly entrances, going into the underworld, a place of the supernatural. So in a lot of world mythologies you get lots of stories about creatures living in caves, or monsters or demons or all kinds of things. But so people in Ireland in prehistory didn't live in caves. They seem to be using them for religious reasons and often depositing their dead in them. In this particular caves, the earliest evidence we have for that is during the Celtic period, when Arden tools were introduced to Ireland. At the latter part of that period, just before Christianity and St. Patrick came, there's evidence of people depositing human remains here in the form of teeth. So there's human teeth, dog teeth and horse teeth all found at some of these caves. So we think it's something to do with their religious belief at the time, because dog and horses were often seen as religious animals. But then later, about 1,200 years ago, people seem to be actually living in the cave during what we call the early medieval period. And we found things like a Viking-style bone comb, a sickle made out of Arden, and other objects, and evidence of people eating and cooking food near cave entrances.
So me and Sam have decided to explore some of the caves up here, and you can see how dark and gloomy and a little bit spooky this is.
Spooky.
Sam, and
Yeah.
there have been numerous tales about these caves.
Yeah.
I have heard tell of some hideous hags.
Indeed, there's 3 hideous hags. There's lots of stories about the caves of Kate, but the most famous one is about the story of the 3 daughters of a guy called Conran McHugh, who was a member of the Tuatha Danann. And Fionn McCool and the Fianna are hunting in the area of Keshcorn, and the noise of the dogs annoy Conran McHugh and his 3 hideous daughters. And the daughters they have magic, and they have these magic threads that they wrap around Fionn McCool and the Fianna. And the Fianna are powerless to resist her. So the hags capture the Fionn and the Fianna, wrap them up in these magic threads and drag them into the darkness of the caves. But fortunately, Gull MacMorna helps Fionn McCool and comes along and kills the 3 hideous hags and releases Fionn and the Fianna. So I think we'll be okay. But the hags, there's a great description of them. I'll read it to you. It says, Finn and Conan reached the cavern's edge and perceived the 3 hideous hags who had busied themselves at its entrance. Their 3 coarse heads of hair all dishevelled, their eyes rummy and bleary and red, their 3 mouths black and deformed, and in the gums of each evil woman of them a set of sharpest, venomous and curved fangs. There are 3 bony jointed scraggy necks maintaining their heads upon those formidable hags. Their 6 arms extraordinarily long, while the hideous and brutish nail that garnished every finger of them resembled a thick-butted, sharp-tipped ox horn. Their 6 bandy legs, thickly covered with hair and fluff, supported them. So they sound pretty hideous, so hopefully we won't bump into them.
That's just a story.
Yeah.
And Cormac McGarrett, the High King of Ireland, he was reared here in the caves by a she-wolf.
Yeah, so Cormac McGarrett is this legendary High King of Ireland. And his mother gave birth to him at a well just at the bottom of the cliffs here, and she had passed out, and when she woke up her son had disappeared, her baby son. And years later her and her brothers found wolves, a pack of wolves, and there was a child running with the wolves, and it transpired that a she-wolf had stolen Cormac and had reared him in a cave here. So there's lots of amazing stories.
So there has been evidence of fires from charcoal has been found here, so we know to a certain extent that people were lighting fires in these caves. And were they coming here, do you think, for ritual purposes, to do with the Lunasa festival or
Okay, yeah,
Sunday?
Yeah, I mean it's a really good question. We know that people were using the caves to put ritual offerings in as part of some kind of religious ceremony. So there's teeth from the late Iron Age, kind of Celtic period. So before Christianity arrived, people were leaving offerings in the caves. But it seems that maybe 1,200 years ago, about the 8th century AD, there was 9th century AD, that there was people living in the caves, maybe temporarily. So they left they were lighting fires, cooking food. So in the excavations from the beginning of the 20th century, we found, or archaeologists found, charcoal and fires and burnt animal bones and evidence of cooking, but also things like bone pins, an Arden sickle for cutting things with, and a Viking-style comb that they'd acquired from somewhere, maybe 10th century. So people were living up here, but in the distant past, it seems people were much more wary of the caves. So that's probably where a lot of the stories originate from. And we know that people were celebrating coming to the caves at the last Sunday in July for a big assembly. And people would gather bilberries, visit the caves and climb to the top of the mountain and leave a stone on the cairn. So that's the same day that people climbed Croagh Patrick the last Sunday in July. So this was the biggest assembly site in Sligo back in the 20th century, early 20th century, late 19th, yeah.
And I can see why people would be attracted here. It's really magical, spooky place.
Yeah,
but
but
really
it's stunning.
interesting.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah.
Thank you, Sam.
Oh, my pleasure.
We're here at Castlebone Fort, and this is a stone fort. The earthen version of this was a ring fort, or some people might refer to them as fairy forts. And I'm joined here today by Joe McGowan, who's a local folklorist and historian in this area. And Joe has a very interesting story to tell us about the Dara Coup, Joe, and its association with this stone fort here.
Indeed so. It's a fantastic old story. And many people throughout the years, it's 300 years ago actually since it happened. It was in September 1722.
Yes.
And it was such a horrific event that it has survived for so long. Of course, Ireland at that time was solely Irish speaking, so the ballad originally was composed in Irish and then with an English translation later on. Well, all those years ago, there was a couple down at Glenade Lake, and the lady, as was the fashion of the time, she went down to the lake to wash her clothes. The husband was at home. Treilach McLaughlin was his name, and her name was Grace Connolly, or Grania Connolly. When she didn't come back after an extended period of time, he was thinking to himself, why is she taking so long? And he decided to go down to see what was taking her so long and maybe give her a hand back with the clothes. When he went down there, he was shocked to see that she was lying at the lakeside with the clothes beside her, and there was a beast, an animal, standing over her. And he was quite shocked by this. She was dead because the beast evidently had killed her. So he didn't know what to do. He went back to the house right away, and of course revenge was on his mind. He was going to kill this beast, and there would have been wolves in Ireland at that time as well, so it wouldn't be unusual for a family to have a weapon. So he went back home and loaded it'd be a muzzle loader, and he came back down, and the beast was still there, you know, with a full belly from surfeiting and eating the woman, unfortunately. So he shot the monster, and he was quite pleased with himself. But as he fired the shot, he heard this whistling, they call it the whistling dour coo. This noise came down the lake because evidently the partner was watching from a distance, and when he saw his partner being shot by this man, he came to the rescue of his creature, which was the dour coo. So Trelloch became quite afraid when he heard this, because there was another one now, and he didn't know there could be several of them there. So he went back up home and consulted with his brother, and the beast came down the lake, was following him all the time, making this horrendous noise. So the brother advised him, the only thing you can do is get out of here as fast as you can. So they saddled up their horses and they headed along the mountainside, this mountain that we see here, all the way from Glenade Lake, going back several miles to here. When they went along, there was a strange feeling in the air. It was almost like nature stood still. The birds stopped singing. A silence came about the place. The wind that blew in the trees stopped. Everything became so silent. It was almost like nature itself was watching this happen for death or victory for the brothers. So they came along at great speed until they came to this fort that we're standing in here now. This is Castlebone in Cashilgarn. The horse had cast a shoe, and just to explain, casting a shoe might not seem like much now, but it's the same as if you got a puncture in your car, you'd have to get out and do something about it. So that was the case here also. There was a blacksmith forge here. They pulled up at the blacksmith to put the shoe on. They heard the whistling, this loud whistling and this thunderous noise coming, with the mate of the dour coo still in pursuit. So they were absolutely terrified because they could be killed. So the blacksmith said to him, the best thing that you can do is get your horses and put them across the entrance to the forge. And when the beast comes, he's going to make a drive, and he'll go right through the horses. And when he does, he handed him a sword, handed McLaughlin a sword. He said, when he puts his head through the horses, you take the sword and cut his head off. So they were ready to go. The horses were across. The dour coo came closer and closer. When he came, he shot right through the horses. The head went right through there. He was such a powerful brute. And when he did, they got the sword and cut his head off. So that was more or less the end of the story. The brothers were quite relieved. But the end of the story is that we're delighted to still have this stone fort here where this actually happened. And tradition tells us that the dour coo is buried right around here on the outside those stone walls.
And one of the other things, Joe, that we find is commonly associated with ring forts, castles, fairy forts are of course the fairies.
Indeed.
And that these are where the fairies live in
Yes,
under
indeed.
the fort.
Yeah.
Do you recall stories connected with ring forts and,
Well,
fairies?
There are many stories circulated long ago around the countryside up to the present time of they were called fairy forts, and the reason they were called fairy forts are, ring forts or they were more often referred to as fairy forts because this is where the fairies were said to live. They would live in hills or in these forts. Of course, they were the descendants of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the magical people who existed in Ireland at one time until they were defeated by the Iron Age Celts and driven underground to forts and hills and places like that. It was considered unlucky to remove anything, even a branch of a tree, or stones from a fairy fort, it would bring bad luck. And there are numerous stories around the countryside of people who interfered with a lone bush, which is another tradition. Or there's one particular story that comes to mind at the moment, is a man not so far away from here, passed on now he has, who saw a bit of land like this and he thought, you know, I'll grow some potatoes there. So he went in and scored a few ridges to plant the potatoes. But they never did well for him. And eventually the man himself came to a bad end. He fell into bad health. And that's what happened to people. If you look, if they call them the gentlefolk, and if you're good to them, they'll be good to you. But if you interfere with them, they can wreak a revenge on you. And a while ago there were many stories about the fairies, and people were very cognizant of the fairies and protective of them as well.
Yeah.
Of course, there was the tradition too of turning the coat inside out.
Yes, and that is a protective way of protecting yourself from the fairies if you're in a certain situation.
Certainly, yes. The fairies could be very mischievous. I suppose to pass the time, like children, they would put people astray at night. And there are many stories of people getting put astray at night in Mullaghmore, all over Sligo and other counties as well. But one of the ways of breaking the spell, and it was very difficult to understand because people walked across the fields to neighbours' houses that time. They never went along the road or drove in a car. This is why people don't see fairies anymore so much, because we get into our car now and we travel down the road in a blaze of lights. And I often say, you know, sure, the fields could be full of fairies at night. Who walks across the fields at night anymore, or by ring force like this to see where the fairies are? But there are many instances of people going through paths that they knew all their lives and not being able to get out. They couldn't find the path, they couldn't find the stile on the ditch where they would get out. They would go round and round. But there would be one knowledgeable person in the group, and they would know from the old people and from tradition that if you take your coat off and turn it inside out, it breaks the spell.
Well, thank you for that, Joe. That was very interesting, and I think just to be on the safe side, leaving this fort, I'm going to turn my jacket inside out.
Well, you're a very wise thing to do, Tamlyn. Thank you for asking me.
Thank you again.